Bae Haijin was eating dinner alone when the broadcast stopped him cold. On the screen, a mother stood on a frozen sidewalk in Manhattan, her 2 children pressed into her coat, everything she owned scattered around her in black trash bags. She had just been evicted. It wasn't her tears that froze him. It wasn't the way her children flinched at every flashing light. It wasn't the neighbors filming from their windows, saying nothing, doing nothing. It was the address scrolling beneath her face. Because that building belonged to him. And what he was about to uncover inside his own empire would undo everything he'd told himself he was. 36-year-old Bae Haijin, head of a Korean syndicate that had quietly threaded itself through half of New York's real estate, had just watched his own machine break a family apart on live television. His penthouse sat above Manhattan like something that had never touched the ground. Floor-to-ceiling glass wrapped every wall, and beyond it the city burned gold and white all the way to the rivers. The kitchen counters were dark stone, imported, untouched by anything more than a knife and a cutting board. He ate standing up most nights. Tonight he sat, a single plate, a single glass, a table built for 12 that had never once been full. He was 36, leader of a syndicate that moved money the way rivers moved water, quietly, constantly underground. His name never appeared anywhere. His signature did, though, buried 3 shell companies deep, on deeds that decided who slept warm and who didn't. But Haijin had never walked the halls of a building he owned, never stood in one of the units, never once asked a tenant if the radiator worked, if the locks held, if the roof leaked. He didn't need to. That was what men like Arthur Sterling were for. Every property moved through Sterling's management company, polished, efficient, bloodless. Haijin reviewed the numbers Sterling gave him, turnover rates, margins, quarterly gains. Tenants weren't people in those reports. They were line items. If they couldn't pay, that was a decision they'd made, not a debt he owed them. He'd said some version of that for years, to the men under him, to himself in the dead quiet of this apartment, when the skyline outside looked less like a view and more like a wall. He said it because it was the only way he knew how to survive what came before. A boy in Seoul who watched bulldozers take his family's home in an afternoon, who learned that paperwork could do more damage than any blade, and that the men who signed it never had to watch it happen. Sentiment gets you buried, the streets had taught him. Contracts keep you clean. He believed that. Until tonight, when the news ticker read an address he knew by heart, and the woman crying into the collar of her own coat became the first tenant he had ever actually seen. Power isn't built on blood, it's built on property. For 10 years, he'd told himself the difference mattered. Tonight, watching a mother and her children thrown onto a frozen curb by a company that carried his money and his name, he understood there had never been a difference at all. All right, if this landed for you the way it should have, drop where you're watching from in the comments and hit subscribe. Because what Haijin finds inside his own paperwork over the next 10 minutes is going to make you furious in a completely different way. What I uncovered inside my own database didn't just break my rules, it broke my soul. Because the address on that screen wasn't a coincidence, it was a confession. Bae Haijin was cutting into his steak when the screen changed everything. The broadcast cut in mid-sentence, red banner flashing across the bottom of the wall-mounted display. Breaking news, Madison Avenue. He didn't reach for the remote. He never did. The volume climbed on its own, and a reporter's voice filled the penthouse, brittle with cold and adrenaline, describing a scene unfolding 2 miles south of where he sat. Catherine Piers was on her knees on the sidewalk. Her daughter clung to her neck. Her son stood frozen beside her, staring at the police lights strobing red and blue across his face, too stunned to cry. Behind them, black trash bags sat stacked against a brownstone stoop, a life reduced to what could fit in plastic. Officers stood at a careful distance. Nobody moved to help her up. Haijin set down his fork. He had seen violence his whole life. He had ordered some of it himself. But there was a particular stillness in watching a mother break in real time, silently, on a 40-inch screen, while he sat wrapped in silk 2 miles away with a full plate in front of him. The blood on the street didn't come from my guns. It came from my lease agreements. The camera pulled back for a wide shot of the building, and that was when he saw it. The address, small and white, scrolling along the bottom ticker beneath the anchor's voice. 1847 Madison Avenue. He knew that address, not from memory, from paperwork. From a stack of shell company filings his lawyers had walked him through 18 months ago, back when he'd still believed that laundering syndicate money through real estate was the clean version of his life. Back when he'd told himself that a deed was safer than a knife, that a corporation could hold blood money without the blood ever touching it. 1847, Madison belonged to him. Not in name, never in name, but every dollar collected in that building's rent rolls, every eviction notice mailed under a corporate letterhead, every decision made by the property management firm running its halls, all of it moved upward, through 3 layers of holding companies, into an account that answered only to him. I built an empire so I'd never see a frozen sidewalk again, yet there sat my signature on the eviction deed. He stood without deciding to. The plate sat forgotten on the table, the wine breathing untouched beside it. Behind him, the Manhattan skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling glass, indifferent and beautiful, the same view he'd paid 4 years of blood and silence to earn. Tonight it looked like nothing, a backdrop to a woman on her knees in the cold. He crossed to the screen and turned the volume higher, as if proximity would change what he was hearing. The reporter was interviewing a neighbor now, a woman in a heavy coat, her breath fogging as she spoke. "They just showed up with a private crew," the neighbor said. "No warning, said her payments were behind, but she has receipts. She has receipts for every month." Hyjin's jaw tightened. He knew what that meant: manufactured default, falsified records. It was a tactic. His tactic, technically, filtered down through layers of management until it became someone else's decision to execute. Arthur Sterling ran the day-to-day of the real estate arm. Sterling was supposed to keep things quiet, efficient, legal on paper, whatever that was worth. Hyjin had never asked how Sterling kept turnover so high, kept margins climbing every quarter like clockwork. He hadn't wanted to know. He knew now. When the news anchor read the address, my penthouse felt less like a palace and more like a cage. He thought of Soul, 10 years old, standing in the mud where his family's house had been that morning, watching bulldozers finish what eviction notices had started weeks earlier. Nobody had asked him for receipts. Nobody had cared that his mother kept every payment stub in a tin box under the floor. The demolition crew hadn't looked at any of them twice. They'd simply arrived and taken and left. He had built his entire life so that he would never again stand on the losing side of that kind of paperwork. And somewhere along the way, without ever choosing it directly, he had become the hand signing it. His phone was already in his grip before he'd finished the thought. He didn't call his lawyer. He called Minyi, his second, the only man who'd known him since before New York, since before the tattoos climbed his throat and the silk replaced the leather jackets of his 20s. "Get me everything on 1847 Madison," Hyjin said, voice flat, controlled in the way that meant the opposite of calm. "Every filing, every eviction this quarter, and get me Sterling, tonight." A pause on the other end. Minyi knew better than to ask questions when Hyjin's voice dropped into that register. "Tonight," he confirmed, and the line went dead. Hyjin stood alone at the window, the city stretched out below him in gold and glass, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like something he owned. It felt like something watching him. Somewhere out there, Catherine Piers was climbing into a shelter van with 2 children who no longer had a home. And somewhere in a spreadsheet 3 floors above street level, Arthur Sterling had signed off on it as a win. Hyjin picked his phone back up and opened Sterling's contact. He had a question for him. And he intended to get the truth, whatever it cost. If seeing a mother evicted on live TV made your blood boil, hit subscribe now, because Hyjin is about to find out just how deep this goes. And if you've been loving this story, I've got a novel collection currently discounted exclusively for loyal subscribers, with free early access to every future novel I release. Link is in the description. Go grab it before the price goes back up. Sterling didn't pick up. It rang 4 times and dropped to voicemail, his recorded voice smooth and unbothered, asking the caller to leave a message and someone would be in touch within 1 business day. Hyjin didn't leave one. He set the phone face down on the counter, and something in him went very quiet, the kind of quiet that used to make grown men in Seoul back out of rooms without being told to. He didn't need Sterling to talk. He had access to everything Sterling had ever touched. He crossed the penthouse to the study, a room he rarely used for anything but signatures, and woke the terminal that held the master files for every property under the syndicate's real estate arm. Minyi had already sent the credentials by the time he sat down, full access, no filters, no version Sterling had cleaned up for board meetings. Just the raw ledgers, the way the system actually ran. He typed Catherine Pierre's name into the tenant database and waited. What came back took his breath in a way gunfire never had. 4 years of records, 48 months of on-time rent, logged in a soft, unremarkable green month after month after month, like a woman keeping a promise to herself. Then 6 weeks ago, the color broke. Red. A missed payment flagged the same week. He confirmed twice that her employer, a downtown hospital system, had processed a mass layoff in its billing department. The system didn't care why the payment was late. It didn't care that she'd worked there for 11 years. It simply registered a gap, and Sterling's management software did exactly what it had been built to do. 58 green ledger marks erased by 6 weeks of manufactured greed. He kept reading, and the further he went, the colder his hands got, even in a room with the heat running. Catherine had called the leasing office 3 times in the first 2 weeks after the layoff. Each call was logged, time-stamped, transcribed by an automated system Sterling had installed to protect against liability. Hae-jin read her own words back to himself. She'd asked for 30 days. She'd offered to pay half now and the rest by the 15th, once her unemployment claim cleared. She'd asked, more than once, if there was a hardship form she could file. There was a hardship form. He found it buried 3 folders deep, a policy Sterling had drafted himself 2 years ago for exactly this kind of situation. A policy that existed on paper, in a compliance binder, purely so that the company could say, if anyone ever asked, that support had been available. Catherine Pierre had never been told the form existed. Nobody had told her because telling her would have interrupted a process that made more money the faster it moved. Hae-jin found the internal memo confirming it, dated the day after her second call, a directive from Sterling's office instructing staff to proceed directly to formal notice for any tenant more than 30 days delinquent, regardless of documented hardship, to maintain portfolio turnover targets for Q4. He read that sentence 3 times. My managers didn't just break the law, they perfected the art of legal violence. There was no gun in that memo. No threat, no raised voice, nothing a courtroom could easily call brutal. Just a man in a good suit deciding that a mother's 11 years of steady work and 4 years of steady rent were worth less than a quarter's numbers on a slide deck. Hae-jin had spent his whole career believing that if he kept his hands clean of certain things, if he built his empire on contracts instead of blades, he had somehow bought himself distance from what men like his old bosses in Seoul used to do. He understood now that distance had been a story he told himself to sleep at night. In the mob, we give warnings. In real estate, they just turn off the heat and wait for you to freeze. Because that was the next thing he found, buried in a maintenance log nobody was ever meant to cross-reference against eviction filings. A work order for 1847 Madison, submitted the same week Catherine's second call went unanswered, requesting the boiler on the 3rd floor be scheduled for delayed repair, pending unit turnover. Delayed on purpose. A building held cold, on purpose, to hurry tenants toward the door before the paperwork even had to say the word eviction out loud. He sat back from the screen, and for a long moment he didn't move. Somewhere in these files was the shape of a question he couldn't yet answer. How many other buildings, how many other Catherines, had passed through this same quiet machinery without a single headline, without a single camera crew showing up in time? Madison Avenue had made the news because a reporter happened to be 2 blocks away covering something else. How many families never got that accident of luck? He thought of his mother, kneeling in mud that used to be a kitchen floor, holding a tin box of payment stubs that no demolition crew had ever bothered to look at. He had promised himself, at 10 years old, that he would build something no one could ever bulldoze out from under him. He had never once considered that he might become the one holding the paperwork that bulldozed someone else. Haijin closed the laptop slowly, deliberately, the way a man closes a door he intends to walk back through with force. He picked up his phone again, not to call Sterling this time, to call Minyi and give him a location and a time. He was going to Madison Avenue himself, tonight, not as a syndicate boss sending men to ask questions, as the man whose name, however hidden, was on the deed, going to look the people he had failed in the eye before he decided exactly what he was going to do to the man who'd failed them for him. If Sterling's memo made your stomach turn the way it turned mine, don't just watch, comment, 1847, below so I know you're standing with Catherine, and hit subscribe, because Haijin isn't done reading yet, and neither are we. Haijin changed out of his silk shirt before he even called for the car. He pulled on a plain black wool coat, no label visible, no rings, no watch worth a second glance, the kind of anonymous he hadn't needed to become since his 20s, when disappearing into a crowd was survival instead of choice. Minyi offered to come with him. Haijin told him to wait at the corner instead. Whatever he was about to see, he needed to see it as himself, not as a boss trailed by muscle. 1847, Madison Avenue sat dark against the block, most of its windows unlit even though it was barely 8 o'clock. He let himself in through a side door someone had propped with a folded newspaper, and the second he stepped into the stairwell, the smell hit him before anything else did. Damp plaster, old water damage, a mustiness that had settled so deep into the walls it had stopped being a smell and become a permanent condition of the building. The walls smelled of damp plaster and old fear, the exact scent of my childhood in Seoul. He stood there a moment longer than he meant to, one hand on the railing, breathing it in. He hadn't smelled that particular mix of cold and mildew and quiet since he was 10 years old, sleeping in a cousin's hallway because his own home had come down that morning. It was strange, the things a body remembered before the mind caught up. The stairwell light on the second floor flickered, dying, then holding. He climbed past it and started down the hallway. Paint peeled in long curling strips near the ceiling, exposing gray plaster underneath. One doorframe near the end of the hall had been jimmied so many times the wood around the lock had splintered away entirely, patched over with a strip of duct tape that fooled no one. He counted 3 units with towels stuffed along the bottom of their doors, the old trick. The trick his own mother had used to keep a draft from eating what little heat made it up from a boiler that clearly wasn't working the way it should. $1 billion portfolio, and my tenants were stuffing towels under window frames to survive February. He knocked on the first door that showed a light beneath it. An older woman answered, chain still on, one eye visible through the gap. She looked at him the way people in buildings like this had learned to look at strangers, already calculating exits, already deciding what she wasn't going to say. He told her he was asking questions on behalf of a housing advocacy group, a small lie that tasted worse than most lies he'd told in his life. And something in his voice must have carried enough weight, because after a moment she unhooked the chain. Her name was Odessa. She'd lived in the building 19 years. She made him tea he hadn't asked for, out of a kettle balanced on a hot plate because her stove had been broken for going on 5 weeks, a repair ticket filed and refiled and never answered. She talked slowly, carefully, the way people talk when they've learned that saying the wrong thing to the wrong person can cost them the roof over their head. Men started coming around about 4 months ago, she said. Not from the building, private invests clipboards, they'd knock at 6 in the morning, stand in the hallway till you open the door just to ask if you'd considered your options. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Mrs. Alvarez, 2 doors down, she's 81. They told her the elevator was going to be out of service indefinitely for repairs. She lives on the 5th floor. 81 years old, and they wanted her taking the stairs every day till she gave up and left on her own. Haijin sat with that for a moment, the tea going cold in his hands. They didn't fear the mob in this building. They feared the man in the 3-piece suit who sent the letters. He had spent his whole adult life building a reputation that made grown men flinch at the sound of his name. And here, in a building he technically owned, an 81-year-old woman was more afraid of an elevator repair notice than she would ever be of him. He asked Odessa, gently, if she knew Catherine Piers. Her face changed, softened, then tightened with something close to anger. Sweet girl, good mother. Odessa shook her head slowly. She fought harder than any of us, called that office every single day for 2 weeks. They just stopped picking up. Then the marshals came. She looked at him directly then, something sharp under the sadness. You said you're with a housing group. Then you tell me, how does a company just stop answering the phone for 2 weeks and nobody at the top notices? Somebody's got to be signing off on all this. Somebody's letting it happen. Haijin didn't answer her. He couldn't, not with the truth, not yet. But the question sat in his chest like a stone the whole rest of the walk down that hallway, because he didn't have an answer that didn't end with his own name. He visited 2 more units before he left. A man in his 60s, unable to work since a fall the winter before, showed him a mousetrap he'd set beneath his kitchen sink because maintenance requests for an exterminator had gone unanswered for 3 months. A young couple with a newborn kept their infant's crib pushed against the one wall that still held heat because the radiator in the nursery had been broken since before the baby was born. By the time Haijin reached the ground floor again, something in his chest had gone raw in a way it hadn't in years. Not the calculated coldness he wore like armor in every boardroom and backroom he'd ever walked into, but something closer to shame, plain and unglamorous, the kind that didn't announce itself with rage. It just sat there, heavy, undeniable. He stepped back out into the cold night air, and standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the dark windows of a building he'd never once set foot in until tonight, he understood with total clarity that reading Sterling's spreadsheets had made him angry. Standing in Odessa's kitchen, drinking her tea, had made him complicit. His phone buzzed in his coat pocket. A text from Minyi, 3 words that stopped him cold on the sidewalk, found Catherine's shelter. The shelter was a converted church basement on 127th Street, and Haijin was standing outside it within 20 minutes of Minyi's text. He almost didn't go in. He stood on the sidewalk across the street for a long moment, watching the fogged basement windows, the shapes of cots and folded blankets visible through the glass, and something in him, the same something that had walked boardrooms without blinking, hesitated for the first time in longer than he could remember. He'd faced armed men without this much doubt, but he made himself cross the street anyway, because doubt, he decided, was not the same thing as an excuse. An older volunteer let him in without much question, distracted by a crying infant 3 cots down. The room smelled of instant coffee and wet coats, and the particular exhaustion of people trying to sleep somewhere that was never built for sleeping. He found Catherine near the back, sitting upright on a cot with her daughter curled against her side, and her son awake beside her, both children still wearing the same clothes from the news broadcast, now wrinkled and slept in. She didn't look broken. She looked like a fortress that had withstood every storm except my own. That was the thing that stopped him 3 feet from her cot. He had braced himself for tears, for collapse, for the kind of visible devastation the cameras had captured on the sidewalk. Instead, Catherine Piers sat with her spine straight and her eyes clear, watching him approach with the flat, appraising look of a woman who had already survived worse than whatever he was about to say. "Can I help you?" she said, not a question, a wall. He introduced himself with a name that wasn't quite a lie and wasn't quite the truth either, said he represented the ownership group connected to her building, and watched her face change from wariness into something colder. "Ownership group," she repeated. "Now they send somebody in person, after the marshals, after the cameras, now." He didn't defend it. There was nothing to defend. He reached into his coat instead and drew out an envelope, thick, more cash than most people saw in a year, and held it toward her. It was, he realized even as he did it, the single stupidest thing he could have offered her. "Keep your money, mister. I don't need a savior. I need a door that locks." She didn't even look at the envelope. She looked at him, dead level, and something in her voice cracked open a version of shame he hadn't known existed in himself until that exact moment. "You think this is about money," she said. "I paid that rent for 4 years, on time, every month. I had receipts. I had a hardship policy nobody told me existed until it was already too late to use it. Money's not what I lost. I lost the one thing I built for my kids with my own 2 hands, and you're standing here with an envelope like that fixes anything." Her son, small, maybe 5, looked up from where he sat pressed against his mother's side. His eyes moved slowly over Hai-jin, the dark coat, the ink climbing visible above his collar, the careful stillness of a man used to being watched. The boy's gaze settled, finally, on Hai-jin's hands. Her 5-year-old son looked up at my tattooed hands and asked if I was the man who took his bed. The question landed somewhere in Hai-jin's chest that no boardroom confrontation, no gunfight, no rival syndicate had ever managed to reach. He crouched, slowly, so he was closer to the boy's eye level, and told him no, as steady as he could make it. He was not the man who took his bed. But even as the words left him, he understood they weren't entirely true, and the weight of that half-lie sat heavier on him than any full one ever had. Catherine watched the exchange without softening. "Don't crouch down and get gentle with my son to make yourself feel better," she said quietly. "You want to help? Then tell me who signed off on falsifying my payment records. Tell me who decided a hardship form I never got told about was more useful sitting in a binder than in my hands. Because somebody made that choice. Somebody with a name." He didn't answer. He couldn't, not with the truth sitting exactly where it did, 3 shell companies removed from his own signature, but his signature all the same. And in the silence, a new question opened up in him, one he wasn't sure he wanted answered. How many more mothers, sitting on how many more cots and how many more church basements across this city, were asking the exact same thing about him tonight, and simply hadn't had a camera crew nearby to make anyone listen? Catherine folded her arms, unmoved by his silence. "You come in here in a coat that costs more than my old rent, holding an envelope like it buys back what your company took. It doesn't. If you really want to make this right, you don't hand me cash and disappear. You find out who did this, and you make sure it never happens to the next family." She looked past him, toward the rows of cots filling the basement, other families, other quiet devastations happening in the same room. "There's a lot of us in here, mister. We're not asking for pity, we're asking for the truth." Hai-jin stood slowly, the envelope still in his hand, unopened, unwanted, useless. For the first time since he'd built this life out of contracts and concrete, he understood that there was no version of buying his way out of what he'd done. Whatever came next, it was going to cost him more than money. He looked at Catherine one last time before he left, and something passed between them that wasn't forgiveness, nowhere close to it, but wasn't dismissal either. It felt, more than anything, like a warning. He walked back out into the cold with her questions still ringing in his ears, and by the time he reached the car, he had already decided exactly whose office he was walking into next. If you're tired of watching rich men show up with envelopes instead of answers, hit subscribe and stand with Catherine, because Hai-jin's next stop is Arthur Sterling's office, and this time he's not coming with questions. He's coming with proof. Arthur Sterling's office was still lit at 9 o'clock at night, which told Hai-jin everything he needed to know before he even stepped off the elevator. The whole floor was glass, walls, doors, even the conference room in the corner, as if transparency itself were a kind of branding. Sterling sat behind a desk with 2 monitors glowing, unbothered, as though a Korean syndicate boss showing up unannounced at 9 p.m. was simply another line item to process before he went home. He didn't stand when Hai-jin walked in. He gestured to the chair across from him, the way a man gestures to furniture he owns. "I wondered how long it would take you to come down here yourself," Sterling said, closing his laptop halfway. "Most principals never do. They prefer the reports." "I read the reports," Hai-jin said, staying on his feet. "Then I read the tenant files behind the reports. Then I stood in a hallway on Madison Avenue that smells like mold, because you scheduled the boiler repair for after the eviction, not before it." Something flickered across Sterling's face, not guilt. Mild irritation, the way a man reacts to being asked to explain something he considers obvious. He opened a drawer, pulled out a tablet, and turned it to face Hai-jin without hesitation, no defensiveness in the gesture at all. "Since you've clearly done your homework, let me show you mine." A chart filled the screen, units turned over, average vacancy time, projected rent increases per renovation cycle. Every unit we clear and release at market rate instead of legacy rate increases margin by roughly 300% over a 5-year hold. Madison Avenue alone, once fully turned, adds an extra 11 million to the portfolio's annual yield. That's not theory. That's Q3 actuals. He talked about human families, the same way my enforcers talk about crate inventory. Haijin stared at the chart, at the clean bars and confident percentages, and felt something in his chest go very still. $11 million. A number stated as flatly as a weather report, sitting on top of a woman named Odessa stuffing towels under her window frame, sitting on top of Catherine Piers folded onto a cot in a church basement with her son asking a stranger if he'd taken his bed. Catherine Piers had a hardship form she was never told about, Haijin said. You wrote that policy yourself. I found the memo. I wrote it for compliance, Sterling said, unbothered. Legal counsel required a documented hardship path to exist in case regulators ever asked. It exists. Nothing in the policy requires we advertise it to every tenant who calls in late. That would defeat the purpose entirely. The purpose of a hardship policy is to help people. Sterling almost smiled. The purpose of a hardship policy is to survive an audit. You hired me to make you legitimate, Haijin. This is what legitimate business looks like. The words landed harder than Haijin expected, because they weren't wrong. Not technically, not on paper. He had hired Sterling 3 years ago specifically because Sterling knew how to make dirty money disappear into clean spreadsheets, how to turn syndicate cash into a real estate empire that federal auditors would never think twice about. He had wanted precisely this, a man who could operate entirely within the law and still deliver results that used to require enforcers and threats. He simply hadn't let himself imagine what, within the law, would actually look like from the inside of an eviction. You manufactured her default, Haijin said quietly. I have the timeline. Her rent went red the same week her hardship call came in. That's not turnover strategy, that's fraud. For the first time, Sterling's composure tightened, though his voice stayed level. It's aggressive account management. There's a difference, legally, and I'd advise you to be careful which word you use in a room with recording devices. He leaned back. Every property manager in this city runs some version of this playbook. I didn't invent predatory turnover, Haijin. I just do it more efficiently than anyone else you could have hired. That efficiency is exactly what built this portfolio from 400 million to 2.6 billion in 3 years. You never asked me how. You just enjoyed the number. Haijin said nothing for a long moment, and in that silence a question surfaced that he couldn't push back down. How many board members? How many silent partners? How many men in suits just like Sterling's had built their own fortunes the exact same way? Invisible, untouchable, never once needing a syndicate or a gun, simply a spreadsheet and the patience to let a mother's hardship call go unreturned. He thought of every man he'd ever ordered enforced against in his old life, debts collected with fists, warnings delivered with broken windows, ugly work he'd never once pretended was clean. And he understood, standing in this glass office under recessed lighting, that Sterling had done something far worse to Catherine Piers than any of it, using nothing but a keyboard and a policy binder, and had walked away calling it a quarterly win. He thought his suit made him clean, but his hands were dirtier than any hitman I ever paid. You're going to reverse every eviction filed under manufactured default, Haijin said, starting with Catherine Piers. Sterling actually laughed, short and disbelieving. Do you understand what that would cost the portfolio? The buyers we're courting for the offshore group expect these units delivered vacant. If I reverse Madison Avenue, I'm not talking about 11 million. I'm talking about the entire redevelopment deal collapsing. I don't care what it costs. You will, Sterling said, standing now, finally, buttoning his jacket with the calm of a man who believed he still held the room. Because without me, you don't have a legitimate business, Haijin. You have a laundering operation with better furniture. Think very carefully before you threaten the only thing standing between you and a federal indictment. The two men stared at each other across the glass desk, and for the first time since he'd walked in, Haijin felt the old cold certainty return. Not the corporate calm he'd worn for 3 years, but something older, something from soul, something that didn't need a spreadsheet to know exactly what it was looking at. He turned and walked out without another word, because he already knew what he was going to do, And it wasn't a conversation Arthur Sterling was going to survive with his authority intact. If you think Arthur Sterling just signed his own downfall, drop a comment below and tell me exactly what you think Hae-jin should do to him. Because next chapter, the gloves come off. And if this story has you hooked, our novel is currently selling on discount right now exclusively for subscribers, with free early access to every future upload. Links in the description. Go get it before the price goes back up. What he was going to do started with a phone call to a man who already knew he was in trouble the moment he saw the caller ID. Detective Ray Henderson answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that particular tightness of a man who'd been waiting for this call for 6 weeks and dreading it every day. Hae-jin didn't waste time with pleasantries. He gave an address, a diner near the precinct, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that had been sitting too long, and told Henderson to be there in 20 minutes. Henderson didn't argue. Men on Hae-jin's payroll rarely did. Hae-jin was already in the back booth when Henderson walked in, still in his jacket, badge clipped at his hip like it belonged there, like it meant something beyond the envelope that showed up in his mailbox twice a month. He slid into the seat across from Hae-jin without being asked, and Hae-jin watched him for a long moment before saying anything at all, letting the silence do what silence always did to men with something to hide. "You were on Madison Avenue the night Catherine Piers got thrown out," Hae-jin finally said, not a question. Henderson's jaw tightened. "I was assigned to the precinct that covers that block. I didn't have a choice about being there." "You had a choice about how you were there." Hae-jin's voice stayed level, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I've seen the incident report. Private security called it in as a disorderly tenant situation. You signed off on that characterization before you'd even gotten out of your car. A badge bought by mob money turns out to be the cheapest thing in New York." Henderson looked down at the table, at the coffee he hadn't touched, and Hae-jin could see it then, the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been telling himself a story for weeks and was tired of holding it up. "Sterling's people called it in as a disturbance," Henderson said quietly. "That's the report I was handed. I responded to what dispatch gave me." "You've been on my payroll 4 years, detective. I don't pay you to respond to what dispatch gives you. I pay you to protect our operations quietly, keep certain things from becoming police matters. I did not pay you to stand on a sidewalk and watch a woman's children get thrown into a snowbank because it kept Sterling's paperwork clean. I paid you to protect our perimeter, detective, not to throw toddlers into snowdrifts." Henderson flinched at that, a real flinch, the kind that came from somewhere honest. He rubbed a hand across his face, and when he looked up again, something in his expression had cracked open just slightly, enough for Hae-jin to see what was underneath, not corruption exactly, but a man who'd made a series of small compromises so gradually he'd stopped noticing the size of what he'd become complicit in. "You want to know the truth," Henderson said, voice low. "I grew up 2 blocks from that building. My grandmother lived in a place just like it, off Lenox, back before it got turned into condos. I watched men just like Sterling's security crew push families out of buildings just like that one when I was a kid. I told myself I became a cop so that wouldn't keep happening on my watch." He shook his head slowly. "And instead I stood there in uniform and made sure it went smooth for the company doing it." Hae-jin let that sit a moment before he asked the question underneath the question. "How many other buildings, Henderson? How many other nights like that one, where you showed up and made sure nobody caused Sterling's crew any trouble?" Henderson didn't answer right away, and in his hesitation, Hae-jin felt a colder unease settle over the whole conversation, because a man who needed that many seconds to count wasn't remembering one incident. He was doing math. "More than Madison," Henderson finally admitted. "I don't know the exact number. Sterling's security company flags precincts ahead of scheduled evictions, requests uniformed presence for de-escalation. It's routine paperwork by the time it gets to patrol level. Nobody up the chain questions it. When a cop fears a mob boss's conscience, you know the city has gone upside down." Hae-jin studied him, this man who had clearly been carrying something heavy long before tonight, who'd shown up to a diner booth already half unraveled, already looking for a way out of a role he'd never fully chosen. There was a version of this conversation where Jin simply reminded Henderson who paid him and what silence was worth. He didn't take that version. Something in Odessa's kitchen, something in Catherine's flat, dignified refusal of his money, had rearranged what Jin was willing to accept as the cost of doing business. "I need the internal eviction logs," Jin said. "Every precinct request tied to Sterling's security company, going back at least a year. Every building, every date, every officer assigned." Henderson's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "That's not something I can just print out and hand you. That's federal exposure if it's ever traced back to me pulling those files without cause." "I'm not asking you to risk nothing," Jin said. "I'm asking you to decide, right now, in this booth, whether you're going to keep being the man who makes Sterling's evictions go smoothly, or whether you're going to be the man your grandmother would recognize." The diner was quiet around them, the hum of a refrigerator case somewhere behind the counter, a waitress refilling sugar packets 3 booths down, utterly unaware that the man across from her was deciding something that would either save or end his career before the night was over. Henderson stared at the table for a long moment, and Jin watched the exact second something in him settled, hardened into a decision. "Give me until tomorrow night," Henderson said quietly. "I know a records clerk who owes me a favor. I can get you what you're asking for." Jin nodded once and started to stand, but Henderson's next words stopped him halfway out of the booth. "There's something else you should know first," Henderson said, his voice dropping lower, glancing once toward the diner's front window before he continued. "Sterling's not just running this out of his own office. 2 nights ago, I overheard something at a security briefing I wasn't supposed to be in. He's already lined up a buyer for the whole portfolio, offshore group, moving fast. And Jin," Henderson hesitated, weighing something. "The paperwork I saw, your name wasn't on it anywhere. He structured the sale so that once it closes, you don't own Madison Avenue anymore. Nobody in your organization does. Nobody in your organization does." The words followed Jin out of the diner and stayed with him the entire ride back uptown, sitting in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward until he understood the full shape of what Sterling had built behind his back. He didn't go home. He went straight to the penthouse study, woke every screen in the room, and called Minyi before the car had even fully stopped. "Get me legal," Jin said. "Not Sterling's legal. Ours. The people who set up the holding structure 4 years ago. I want them on a call in 15 minutes. By the time he reached his desk, 3 of his own attorneys were already on the line, voices thick with sleep, confused and cautious in the way men get when a call at this hour never brings good news. Jin didn't waste time easing them into it. He asked one question, the only question that mattered. Could the offshore sales Sterling had structured actually close without the syndicate's underlying ownership stake being disclosed and signed off on by the original holding entity? The answer, after a pause that told him everything before the words did, was no. Not without forged signatures. Not without someone inside the chain lying to a title company and a federal filing at the same time. Sterling hadn't found a clever loophole. He'd built a crime on top of a crime, betting that Jin would never look closely enough to notice his own empire being sold out from under him. That settled it. At 2:00 a.m., I shut down 14,000 eviction orders with a single phone call. He gave the order directly to the management software administrator, a man who owed his position entirely to Jin's approval and understood immediately what silence would cost him if he hesitated. Every pending eviction filing across the portfolio, every scheduled rent increase, every foreclosure notice queued for the next 90 days, frozen. Not delayed. Frozen, with an administrative lock that required his personal authorization to lift. 14,000 units. Families in 6 cities who would wake up tomorrow morning to notices rescinded instead of notices served, though none of them would ever know his name or understand why. It was, Jin thought, the first decision he'd made in years that cost him money instead of making him more of it. It felt, strangely, like the first clean thing he'd done since he was 10 years old. Sterling called within the hour. Of course he did. "You've lost your mind," Sterling said, no pleasantries, voice tight in a way Jin had never heard from him before. Do you understand what you just did? The offshore buyers require guaranteed vacancy timelines. You just voided every projection in the deal. I know exactly what I did. The board is already mobilizing, Sterling continued, and Hyjin could hear other voices behind him now, low and urgent, a room full of men reacting to a fire they didn't yet fully understand. Half of them have already discussed what happens if certain information about your organization's involvement in this portfolio finds its way to federal prosecutors. I'd think very carefully, Hyjin, before you push this any further. My board thought they were dealing with a landlord. They forgot they were dealing with the Chilseong syndicate. Hyjin almost laughed at the threat, not because it wasn't dangerous, but because Sterling still didn't understand the difference between the two men he'd been managing for 3 years. The quiet real estate principal who reviewed quarterly reports, and the man underneath him who had survived things federal prosecutors couldn't begin to imagine. A threat like that, from a man in a hand-tailored suit sitting behind a glass desk, landed on Hyjin the way a paper cut lands on a man who has already survived being shot. Let them call the prosecutors, Hyjin said calmly. Let's see how well an offshore buyout survives a federal investigation into fraudulent title transfers, Arthur, because that's what you actually built, not a clean exit, a forged signature waiting to be discovered by the first regulator who looks too closely. Silence on the other end. The kind of silence that told Hyjin he'd found the actual weak point in Sterling's carefully constructed confidence. Not loyalty to the board, not conviction in the numbers, but the plain fear of a man who had assumed he'd never have to answer for the paperwork himself. If the law protects your greed, Sterling, then let's see how well your lawyers handle my world. You're threatening me, Sterling said finally, quieter now. I'm informing you, Hyjin said. Every filing is frozen. Every sale is frozen. And starting tomorrow morning, I'm bringing in my own auditors to go through every transaction you've executed in the last 3 years, starting with Madison Avenue and working backward. If what I find matches what I already suspect, the board meeting you're planning won't save you. It'll be the place I end this. He hung up before Sterling could answer, and stood alone in the study, the city glittering silently through the glass behind him, feeling something settle into place that had been missing for a long time. Not peace, not yet, but purpose, sharp and clear in a way. The last 3 years of spreadsheets and quarterly reports had slowly worn away without him noticing. His phone buzzed almost immediately. Minyi, not Sterling. Boss, Minyi said, voice careful. Henderson just called. Said you need to see the eviction logs tonight, not tomorrow. Said there's something in them that changes what kind of fight this actually is. Hyjin's grip tightened on the phone. What is it? He wouldn't say over the line. He said it involves a second building, one that isn't in any of the portfolio filings you've already seen. He said it's registered under a name you're not going to recognize, and that once you see it, you'll understand exactly why Sterling was in such a hurry to close this deal before anyone came looking. If you felt that adrenaline the second Hyjin froze 14,000 evictions in one phone call, hit subscribe. Because every family in that portfolio just got a door that locks, and Sterling's about to learn exactly what that costs him. And if you can't wait to see how this war ends, don't forget to check out our novel that is currently selling on discount right now exclusively for loyal fans of this channel. With free early access to every future upload, links in the description. Go grab it now. Send it to me now, Hyjin said into the phone, and Minyi read him a name over the line, unfamiliar, foreign to every filing he'd ever reviewed, that settled into Hyjin's chest like a splinter he wouldn't have time to remove until morning. Whatever it meant, it would have to wait until the sun came up. Some things couldn't be rushed, and some things couldn't wait even a single day, and Hyjin already knew which category Catherine Piers belonged to. He called the construction crew at 3 in the morning. They were men he'd used before, on projects that required speed, discretion, and a willingness to work through the night without asking questions about why a job needed to move this fast. He gave them 48 hours and told them cost was not a consideration. New boiler, new wiring, new locks, deadbolts on every door, the kind that couldn't be forced with a crowbar the way half the doors in that building had been. Fresh paint over the peeling plaster. a crib rail replaced with real furniture, a proper bed for a 5-year-old boy who'd looked at Haijin's hands and asked if he'd taken his. He didn't sleep those 2 days. He walked the unit himself twice, once at the start to see exactly what needed undoing, once near the end to make sure it had actually been undone. Standing in the finished kitchen at dawn on the second day, watching morning light hit clean countertops and a stove that worked, he felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest, not triumph, nothing that grand. Just the quiet, unglamorous relief of having fixed one small thing correctly, after weeks of discovering how much he'd broken without ever meaning to. Catherine arrived that afternoon expecting a trick. She said as much the moment she stepped off the elevator, Minyi having brought her, and the children from the shelter with nothing more than a message that her housing situation had changed. Her face, when Haijin met her in the hallway, was guarded in exactly the way he'd expected, arms crossed, eyes moving past him toward the door of Unit 4B like she was already calculating what kind of trap waited on the other side. "If this is another envelope," she said, "you can save yourself the walk." "It's not an envelope," Haijin said, and opened the door. She stepped inside slowly, her son's hand gripped in hers, her daughter balanced on her hip. For a long moment she didn't say anything at all. She walked the length of the living room, ran her fingers along a windowsill that no longer needed a towel stuffed beneath it, stood in front of a radiator that was actually warm to the touch. Her son let go of her hand and ran straight for his new bed, bouncing once on the mattress before catching himself, looking back at his mother like he wasn't sure he was allowed. The sound of a deadbolt clicking shut is the sweetest music a homeless child can ever hear. Catherine tested the new lock herself, sliding the deadbolt closed and open again, closed and open, the way a person tests something they've learned not to trust. When she finally turned back to Haijin, her eyes were wet, though her voice didn't shake. "You did this in 2 days," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Lifetime protected lease," Haijin said. "Not month to month, not tied to any management company. It's in your name, filed with the city, structured so it can't be touched by whoever owns this building next. Even if I'm gone, even if everything above me changes." She was quiet for a long moment, watching her daughter reach up toward a window that let real light into a room that used to be cold and dim. Then she turned back to him, and the gratitude in her eyes was real, but so was the steel underneath it, the same steel he'd seen on that church cot 2 nights ago. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't matter," she said. "It matters. My bobbies have a warm bed tonight because of what you did. I won't insult either of us by acting otherwise." She held his gaze, unflinching. "But you gave us back our room, Haijin. What about the 30 families down the street? Odessa's stove still doesn't work. Mrs. Alvarez is still climbing 5 flights because your company broke her elevator on purpose. You fixed the one apartment with a camera crew attached to it. That's not justice. That's public relations with better lighting." Haijin didn't argue with her, because there was nothing to argue. She was right, and he'd known she would be right before she ever said it. He'd simply needed to hear it out loud from her, standing in the one room he'd managed to make whole again. "This isn't the end of it," he said. "It's the start." "I hope that's true," Catherine said, "because a brand new kitchen can't erase the memory of sleeping on a church floor. My son's going to remember that basement for the rest of his life. New paint doesn't undo that. It just means it doesn't have to happen to him twice." She said it without cruelty, without theater, simply as fact, the kind of fact a woman states once she's decided a man deserves to hear the truth instead of gratitude alone. Haijin absorbed it the way he'd absorbed everything else this week, without defending himself, because defending himself was no longer the point. His phone buzzed in his pocket as Catherine's son climbed fully onto his new bed, laughing for the first time since Haijin had met him. He glanced down at the screen, at Minyi's name, and beneath it, a single line that pulled the warmth of the room away from him instantly. "The second building, it's a shelter. Sterling's company owns the land underneath it, and the demolition permit is already filed." A shelter. Sterling was demolishing a shelter, and the second Haijin read the words, he understood exactly what kind of man he'd hired 3 years ago without ever fully looking at him. He didn't say anything to Catherine right away. He simply told her the apartment was hers, permanently, whatever happened next, and left before his face could show her the fury that was already building underneath his calm. By the time he reached the street, Minyi had confirmed the rest. The shelter on 127th, the very building where Catherine had spent 2 nights on a cot, sat on land Sterling's company had quietly acquired 8 months ago, buried under a name so far removed from the main portfolio that even Hai-Jin's own attorneys hadn't flagged it. The demolition permit had been filed that morning. Sterling wasn't just protecting his deal. He was accelerating it, clearing every obstacle before Hai-Jin could stop him. Henderson called an hour later with the eviction logs, and buried in them, the confirmation Hai-Jin needed, a paper trail connecting Sterling's security company directly to falsified default records across 9 buildings, Catherine's among them, along with wire transfers to 2 board members who'd been quietly compensated to fast-track the offshore sale. It was enough. More than enough. Hai-Jin called an emergency board meeting for that night, using Sterling's own protocol against him, the one requiring 24 hours notice unless waived by unanimous written consent. Consent Sterling had built into the bylaws himself, years ago, to push deals through fast. Hai-Jin waived it. Every board member scrambled to comply, unaware that the man calling the meeting already knew exactly what he intended to do with it. He didn't wear the suit that night. He wore the dark silk shirt, sleeves loose at the wrist, the ink on his hands and throat fully visible under the boardroom's cold white light, no jacket to soften it, no performance of corporate respectability left to maintain. He walked in flanked by Henderson in plain clothes and 6 members of Catherine's tenant coalition, Odessa among them, her spine straight, her eyes steady on Sterling the moment she crossed the threshold. I walked into the boardroom in dark silk and tattoos, leaving the suits paralyzed in their leather chairs. The room went still. 12 board members sat frozen mid-conversation, papers halfway signed, a presentation slide still glowing on the screen behind Sterling showing the offshore group's letterhead. Sterling himself stood at the head of the table, and for the first time since Hai-Jin had met him, something like real fear moved behind his composed expression. "This meeting doesn't concern outside parties," Sterling said, recovering fast, gesturing toward Henderson and the coalition members. "I don't know what you think you're doing." "I think I'm finishing what you started," Hai-Jin said, and set a folder on the table, sliding at the length of the polished glass until it stopped in front of Sterling. "Wire transfers to 2 board members, timestamped the same week they voted to approve fast-tracked turnover targets, falsified default records on 9 buildings, and a demolition permit filed this morning for a shelter housing 43 people, including 3 families displaced by your own evictions." A woman near the far end of the table opened the folder with visibly shaking hands, scanning the first page, then looked up at Sterling with an expression that had already convicted him. "This is exactly the kind of federal exposure I warned you about," Sterling said, turning to Hai-Jin now, voice sharpening. "You want to bring investigators into this room. They'll be looking at your organization just as hard as mine. You thought paper beat blood, Arthur, but truth beats both." "I've already spoken with my attorneys," Hai-Jin said evenly. "Every dollar in this portfolio traces back to legitimate holding structures my organization built years before you touched it. Your fraud is separate, documented, and entirely yours. 9 falsified default filings with your signature on the compliance sign-off. Bribery of 2 board members using company funds. A demolition permit on inhabited property filed without the required relocation notice." He let that settle before he continued. "You didn't just break my trust, Arthur. You built a federal case against yourself and left my name off every page of it." Odessa stepped forward then, unbidden, her voice steady despite the room full of men who'd never once expected her to speak in a place like this. 81-year-old woman climbing 5 flights because you broke her elevator on purpose," she said, looking directly at Sterling. "I hope that number you were so proud of was worth it." Sterling's composure finally cracked, color rising in his face, as he looked around the table for support and found board members already leaning away from him, already calculating their own exposure. "This is a hostile takeover," he said. "I'll have my own attorneys in this room within the hour." "You'll have handcuffs before you have attorneys," Henderson said quietly, stepping forward with his badge visible for the first time that night. "I've already forwarded the falsified eviction logs to the DA's office. Federal fraud, obstruction, and endangerment charges tied to that demolition permit are being drafted right now." The room fell into total silence. Hai-Jin watched Sterling's face move through disbelief, calculation, and finally something close to defeat, and he felt none of the satisfaction he'd expected to feel in this moment. Only clarity. "Effective tonight," Hai-Jin said, turning to the board. "Every property in this portfolio transfers into a permanent community land trust, structured so no future owner, buyer, or board can ever repeat what happened on Madison Avenue. Sterling's authority is terminated. Anyone who voted to accept his bribes has 1 hour to resign before their names appear in the same filing as his. Today, this portfolio stops being a bank for criminals and starts being a roof for human beings." He looked at Sterling one last time, at the man who'd once told him a suit made legitimate business look clean, and said nothing else, because there was nothing left worth saying to him. But as security escorted Sterling from the building minutes later, Sterling turned back at the door, and the look on his face wasn't fear anymore. It was something closer to satisfaction, and his final words landed in the room like a blade left behind on purpose. "You think this ends with me," Sterling said. "Check the buyer's name on that offshore contract, Hai-Jin. Then ask yourself how long they've actually known who you are." The buyer's name turned out to belong to a company so deeply buried in paperwork that it took his own attorneys 3 weeks to trace it back to its source. And when they finally did, what they found wasn't the ambush Sterling had promised. It was a group of minor investors with no real power, men who'd signed onto Sterling's offshore deal without ever understanding what they were buying into. Men who folded the moment federal investigators started asking questions about falsified default records and a demolition permit filed against an occupied shelter. Sterling's parting threat, in the end, had been exactly what Hai-Jin suspected: the last card of a man with nothing left to play, thrown down purely to leave a scar on his way out the door. 18 months had passed since that night in the boardroom, and 1847 Madison Avenue no longer smelled of damp plaster or old fear. Hai-Jin sat in his penthouse on a quiet Tuesday evening, a plate in front of him that he'd actually finished this time, and turned on the news out of habit more than expectation. The segment that came on wasn't breaking news. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, no mother crying on a frozen sidewalk. It was a quiet human interest piece, the kind that ran near the end of a broadcast when the anchors had already covered the day's disasters and needed something gentler to close on. The camera showed the front steps of 1847 Madison, freshly painted, warm light glowing behind new windows. It showed a community garden where a parking pad used to be. And it showed Catherine Piers, standing at a podium in the building's newly renovated lobby, addressing a room full of tenants at what the caption identified as a community land trust board meeting. For 20 years, the silence in my home felt like evidence. Tonight, it feels like peace. Hai-Jin watched her speak with the same fierce dignity she'd carried into every room he'd ever seen her in, explaining to a room full of neighbors how the trust worked, how no future owner could ever again treat their homes as a line item on someone else's balance sheet. Odessa sat in the front row, her hands folded, nodding along. Mrs. Alvarez was there too, in a seat near the newly repaired elevator, no longer climbing 5 flights of stairs to survive her own building. The reporter asked Catherine what had changed her life most in the past year and a half. She didn't mention money. She didn't mention the man who'd shown up at her shelter cot with an envelope she'd refused. She talked instead about the deadbolt on her door, about her son sleeping through the night without asking if strangers were coming to take his bed, about 31 families across the portfolio who now held permanent, protected leases instead of month-to-month fear. Hai-Jin sat alone in his penthouse, tattooed hands wrapped around a glass he hadn't touched in several minutes, and understood that he was watching the only kind of legacy that had ever actually mattered. Not the one his father figures in the old life had taught him to build, not the one Sterling had tried to convince him was simply the price of being legitimate, but something quieter and harder won. I used to hide behind my money. Now I stand behind my people. He thought of Seoul sometimes still, the mud where his family's house used to stand, the tin box of payment stubs no demolition crew had ever bothered to look at. He understood now that he'd spent 20 years trying to outrun that boy by building something too large to ever be bulldozed again, and had nearly become, without meaning to, the very hand holding the paperwork that did the bulldozing. It had taken a mother's refusal of his money, an old woman's tea, a 5-year-old's honest question, to show him the difference between an empire and a home. His phone buzzed once on the table beside him. A message from Minyi, brief, almost an afterthought at the end of a long day. Community Trust filed its first-year report. Every unit occupied, 0 evictions. Haijin set the phone down and looked out at the Manhattan skyline one more time. The same view he'd once believed was the whole point of everything he'd built. It looked different now. Not smaller, exactly. Just less like a wall, and more like a city full of doors he was finally responsible for keeping open instead of shut. The city still has monsters, but Madison Avenue finally has a lock that holds. He knew there would be other buildings, other Sterlings, other quiet cruelties hiding behind clean spreadsheets in glass offices across the city. The fight he'd started wasn't finished, not by a long measure. But for tonight, watching Catherine Piers stand tall in a lobby that used to smell of fear, he let himself sit in something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Not guilt, not the old cold calculation that had run his life for years. Just quiet, and for the first time, quiet that felt earned. If this story reminded you that real power means protecting people instead of profiting off them, subscribe now so you never miss another high-stakes rescue story. And if you loved Haijin's journey, my full-length novel collection is available right now, link in the description, so you can keep living in this world long after this chapter ends.